Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with John Wrigley. It's September 29th, 2022. We're at J. Wrigley Vineyard in Sheridan. John, thank you so much for joining us today. As we usually start our interviews, let's ask you a nice, easy question to start, which is why wine?
It is a rather complicated story, but I started out in college enjoying beer, as many people do, and that was kind of the beginning of a beer making craze. So that would have been about through 1980 through 84ish, right in that range. So a lot of my friends were into making beer, and to be quite frank, most of it was horrible. Barely could stomach it, and so I thought that I would try making wine. And I was not a wine drinker. I was really a beer drinker. That was through my college years, and so I went down to the beer store, and they had a winemaking kit, and it was a package that had like a gallon of concentrated grape juice, a little packet with some what they called Camden tablets, and a little packet of yeast. And then there's some instructions were on it, which basically was like take 1 can of grape juice, pour it in 3 cans of water into it, sprinkle the yeast into the container, cover it with a cloth, and wait for 3 or 4 days. So that was my first introduction to wine, and so I had converted it to a carboy and tasted it. And the first day I'm going, well, that's not terrible. And that isn't glowing by any means, but so that's not terrible. I'll give it another try. So I had, a glass and then put the cork back in the jug, and next day came back and tried it again. I said, well, it's still okay, but something's changed. It doesn't taste like it did yesterday. So I thought, well, I don't know. I got the lawn to mow and different things. I got stuff to do, so I can't stay here and worry about this right now. So 2 or 3 days went by, and go back and tried it again. Took a sip, and I just went, wow, this is horrible. Horrible. I could not figure out what had gone wrong. And so for me then, because I was very curious, it just lit a passion in me. I have to figure out what went wrong. Of course, through my research, I'd figured out that what had happened is the wine had oxidized, and and started spoiling. It's no different than if you have a bottle sitting on your counter and you leave half a bottle open for a week and go back to drink it, it's probably not going to be palatable. So from that, it really kind of lit a fire in me, and I started ordering books from different libraries and reading and trying to educate myself about it. And I had grown up on a farm in Idaho, and so I knew about farming and cultivating crops and harvesting and that sort of thing. But this was different because this was the processing side of it. And so I started doing a lot of extensive research, and by that time I had graduated from college and had gotten a job in the insurance industry. It was a very poor time in the economic community for a job, and so one of the few jobs I could get out of college in the early 80s was as an insurance adjuster. But what that did was allow me to travel extensively, and so then when I would travel through California and places like that, handling claims, I would stop by the UC Davis bookstore and I would buy their textbooks. And so as I would travel, whether it was on a plane or in a hotel room or at night, I would read the textbooks from UC Davis, which is one of the premier winemaking colleges in the United States. So essentially, I taught myself how to make wine. And then I started buying wine from other growers. But in the interim, I experimented with all different kinds of fruits, wild things like elderberries and gooseberries and things like that aren't typically used to make wine. But I was just experimenting, trying to understand the process. So for me, that's what really hooked me, was the process itself. I had to figure out what went wrong, and how to fix it. So that's how that all evolved.
We'll come back and pick up the story there in a second, but I want to back up a moment. Tell us a little bit about life before you discovered wine. Tell us about kind of growing up, where you grew up, and what made you decide to go to college, where, and why.
So I was born in '61 in Burley, Idaho, and my family operated a large ranch which was homesteaded in the early 1900s. So I was one of the kids on the farm. My dad was a partner in the farm with his brothers and my grandfather. And so we operated row crop grounds, that'd be corn for silage, for feed for the animals. And we had several thousand head of sheep, several hundred head of cattle. My dad was responsible for the hog operation, so that was primarily my focus growing up, feeding these animals. And so if you weren't going to school, you were working, raising crops, processing crops, driving tractors, getting crops in for forage to get through the winter months, things like that. So that was really how I grew up. And then I graduated from Burley High School and went to Idaho State University. And that was the closest university to where I lived. And so I had 2 steers, and I sold my 2 steers, bought a car, and everything I owned I packed into the back seat of my '74 Chevy Nova and drove to college, and which was an unbelievably eye-opening experience. And it was, an educational opportunity, but also a tremendous opportunity for growth and development as a young adult or somebody aspiring to be a young adult. But anyway, so a lot of the heritage and the things that we have for this property here are things that I brought from my experiences when I was on the farm. So our label, which is the Connected JW, is actually a free-handed stylistic version of my grandfather's cattle brand from, I believe, 1906. And so we happen to have one of the original brands here. So I've stylized it, and so I try and pay a little homage to my history, but I didn't want to go back and be a farmer in those kind of scenarios. But also, most college kids don't really have the kind of assets behind them to start a 200-acre vineyard. And so it took me a period of time to acquire those assets. So out of college, I started working as an insurance adjuster, worked for a number of different companies, eventually ended up as a national catastrophe claims manager for Farmers Insurance. And I managed some of the really big catastrophes around the country, hurricanes in Florida and the Gulf Coast and big wildfires in California and things like that. And so that's where I actually made my way into a management structure where I had enough resources to accumulate the funds to purchase our property here. But I still had the knowledge of the farming and how to develop a property and the basic horticultural knowledge to bring something from an infant of a vine or plant all the way through harvest. So it really is a lifetime of experience that I brought with me to this particular project. And along the way, I happened to meet my wife, Jody, who was very enthusiastic about joining me here, participating in it. And so I actually proposed to her on this property on the weekend that we discovered this on a property hunting trip. And from there, we've built our house here, and started our family here. And so this is a very, very special place to us.
Well, let's talk about discovering the place then. You mentioned earlier that you'd spent quite a bit of time self-teaching yourself about wine. At what point did you start to think about investing into something like this, and how did you go about finding the place to do it?
Well, I had lived in California as one of my places that I had spent time in the corporate arena, and loved wine, had gravitated towards it. Did not like distilled spirits quite as much, and beer, of course, becomes kind of pedestrian after a while, and so wine I found particularly interesting, and so I live very close to Napa Valley, and so spent a lot of time over there. But I also tasted in a number of different AVAs and began to understand the differences in wines from different areas. And I realized that was, I really would like to do something like this because I felt that I had the knowledge and the basic understanding of viticulture, that I could grow, be successful as a grower and as a winemaker. And so I had looked around for a couple of years in California and eventually found some property that was in the Amador County area. And there's some beautiful Zinfandels that come from that area. Brought in originally by the California Gold Rush, the miners that came in. Then there's still some old vines around there that are that old, but really what turned the tide for me is I happened to be an avid fisherman, having grown up in the Northwest and spent many, many years fly fishing and tying my own flies and things like that. But I was single at the time and decided, well, I want to go up to Oregon and go salmon fishing. So I had flown up here and had gone out salmon fishing on the Columbia River and was on my way back to the hotel and driving. And I said, wow, there's a winery. I didn't even know Oregon had a wine industry. So I pulled in and I went in, and there I was the only person inside other than the attendant, and said, well, let's see what you got. And so he started pouring wines. And it was an eye-opening moment, hard to describe. It was just like, wow, I was so blown away by the Pinot Noirs that I just said, if you can make wine like that here, and as a bonus get to go salmon fishing, I'm all in. So I immediately then began looking for property here in Oregon and doing a lot of research on it because I didn't really understand how the Oregon wine industry had flourished. You know, the 4 or 5 families that had first started here, and Mr. Eilrith and some of the other people that was early on. And so I started coming up here, and I'd made probably 5 or 6 trips here to Oregon, tasted around the area until I had found wines that really I found to be distinctive. And so some of those wines that I found after I had sat down with a map and circled the wineries that I liked, I found that all of them followed in the Coast Range foothills. So for my palate, that's what worked for me, was the soils in the Coast Range foothills. And because I was a farmer initially, I recognize that it doesn't really matter what crop you have, it's the soil that makes the crop. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's the most rich soil or whatever, but there are certain characteristics about some soils that yield what you specifically are looking for. And so, for an example, some of the things that make a great wine grape may be terrible if you're trying to raise alfalfa, you know, or soybeans or corn or things like that. They all have different requirements. And so by that tasting process, I felt that I had found what would be suitable, and therefore I then started looking primarily in Yamhill County in the Coast Range foothills. And when I would have time off from my job, then I would come up, fly here to Portland, and I would spend the entire weekend just driving up and down the roads I would do things like I'd stop and taste the blackberries. I'd make notes about how they tasted, and I would have the soil maps, and I would make notes as to the quality of local fruit. And then there's a number of other things that you can look for that will identify whether land is suitable for grapes. So for instance, when I found this property, I talked to a number of people that said, you're too far to the west and your elevation is too high and you'll never be able to grow grapes there. But I hiked around through the property, and at that point this was just a Christmas tree farm, had been originally planted in cherries, hence the name Cherry Hill, but that goes back to the early part of the last century and middle part of the last century. And hiking through the timber and everything, I found old pear trees, lots of apples. So if you have pitted fruits, then you have enough heat units that can ripen grapes. So therefore, if your pHs are compatible, then you can do a very good job of raising grapes to maturity. So when we planted out here, to my knowledge, we were one of the furthest westernmost vineyards that was planted in the Willamette Valley, at least in this area. And I'm sure that there are some people around that had smaller, private dozen vines or something like that. But from a commercial standpoint, I think we were the first that was this far to the west. And so anyway, for that I'm particularly proud of. Took a gamble and it worked out. So very, very pleased about that.
So describe for me then the first time you saw this property. What made you excited about it? What made you think this was a place worth taking a gamble on?
So the very first time that I saw the property was driving up Cherry Hill Road. And you wind around Cherry Hill and you don't really see this property until the very last corner. And then you look up and there's this broad face of this hillside that you can see. And at the time, a good portion of this property was planted into Christmas trees. So you could actually see rows on the property, which allowed some visualization of, oh, I can see how this could all be put into a vineyard. And that was the westernmost portion of the property. The easternmost portion of the property was in, it's called reprod. It's just timber land that is not at the age that it could be harvested. And I think ours was about 10 years old. So it was Douglas fir, but it was very small. And so when I saw that, I hiked the property, didn't make an offer or anything at that point, but it actually was advertised for sale as a quarry. And the quarry on our property was the quarry that supplied the gravel to build the federal prison over here in Sheridan. And so Jody and I were there with my sister, Karen, and so we stopped off of Gopher Valley, which is another entrance to the property, and we hiked in past all of the no trespassing signs, and saw the quarry. And the interesting thing about the quarry is it's about a 160-foot high cliff face. And what it does is allow you to see all the geological history off of this property because it's been carved out of the same slope as the soils that are above it. And so you could see where there were the marine sediments, you could see the volcanic intrusions through it, and each of those yield very, very complex soils that are on our property that yield amazing wines because of the complexity of the soils. They aren't singular, they're very complex because each one of those soil types yield a different flavor profile for the wines. And And then the other thing that was really a nice feature about all of that was an operating quarry. And so in order to buy the property, we had the quarry with it plus the farmland. And so about 2/3 of the property was income producing while I was still working corporate. I said, well, that's a pretty good way to purchase that property because the tenants are making the payment. And so we did that for several years until the Christmas tree leases were up and we had ground that we could clear and plant. And so then we planted that into rehab, and then also the what was forested that was the young, we cleared that, and those were the first blocks that we planted.
What year did you find the property, and what year did you plant the property?
Let's see, I believe we found the property in 2005. I had actually, this is a personal story, somebody might find it humorous. Anyway, it was 2005 and I had been working Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans for my company, managing that. And so I finally had a weekend off after about a month, and I called my sister and says, hey, I'm going to go to Oregon and look for vineyard land. If you want to join me, that'd be great. She goes, well, that's fine. I've got a friend that would like to come too. She likes wine. I said, well, I don't care as long as she knows that we're looking for wine and it's not just a party. So I land at the luggage carousel at PDX, and there's my sister, and there's Jody at the time, who I didn't know. And I thought, wow, she's kind of cute. And we actually ended up having our first kiss on this property about a day and a half later. So from there, our romance blossomed. We ended up marrying and moving up here and had our family here and have developed this place together.
That's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, I have to give most of the credit to building the business to Jody. She's the one that's just an unbelievable business mind and marketer, promoter. I'm I would call him the heavy lifter person, the person that knew the farming and the plowing and didn't mind 12, 14-hour days, knew winemaking. So those are we divided into different arenas, and it worked out very good because it's a combined success. I would not have made it without her, but I do suspect she might have made it without me. She's just pretty good at that. So anyway, it's been a combined effort, and very, very proud of what we've done. So anyway, that's how that all evolved.
Take me through some of the milestones for you. Were there certain kind of markers along the way that you're particularly proud of? Getting the first vines in the ground, or getting certain things built, or getting wine produced? What were the kind of notable memories for you on that part of things?
Oh man, that goes back. So when we moved here, that was during a time period where there was a very difficult time finding housing anywhere around. So we had moved here in 2008. And we ended up renting a small home in McMinnville. And so I would get up early in the morning, drive out here, start working on the ground, trying to get it ready for planting, picking out stumps and sticks, and because we were really doing it ourselves. We didn't just hire crews. But also at the time we had young children. And so I think some of my most fond memories are Jody would come out with a picnic with the kids and would let them just run around naked on the property while we would have a picnic, and she'd take them home. They were just filthy and from running around in the dirt, but that was pretty special.
So I want to focus on the farming and the wine production for a little bit here. So you mentioned obviously you had a farming background. You had an idea of how things would work. As you started to lay out the property and started to get vines in the ground, was there a particular learning curve or surprises for you as you started to get that part of things going?
Well, I actually believe that I had enough of a background that I understand a little bit about farming practices. It's a little different farming flat ground than on up here, and so we have some pretty significant slopes. And the thing that you have to be very careful about is not always can you lay out your rows so that it's optimum for being true north and south or whatever. You have to be very careful about how you lay things out, because if you get a side hill and roll equipment or things like that, then that's very dangerous. And so the first blocks that we planted were everything that we could plant that was as true north and south as possible. And so that's one of the things about this property that was very beneficial is, so we have east-facing slopes and we have north-south facing slopes. So we really are able to maximize a large percentage of the property with rows that are can be farmed with a wheeled tractor straight up and down. And we have a lot more plantable ground that's premier ground, but they're not exactly north and south. And so to farm those, I just placed in, the second or third evolution of the property where we would have a tracked vehicle like a dozer or a cat that was able to be a little bit more stable when it's driving on a side hill. And so I've actually only had one accident on the property involving a rollover of equipment, and that was about during COVID. And I'd never had an accident since I was a kid on a tractor, and happened to be turning to turn and go straight uphill, but on the side hill at the bottom, the lower tire collapsed a gopher tunnel, and that really was almost the last thing I remember. But anyway, totaled the tractor, and so those are the kind of things that can happen if you're not paying attention to how you're laying out your vineyards and things like that. So up to that point, I felt that we were, pretty safe. But nonetheless, that's just one of the hazards of farming on ground that isn't flat. But you have to have the slopes for the cold air to run off. Otherwise, you start having frost damage and things like that. So I'm a lot more careful now. But, accidents are called that for a reason.
How did you choose and acquire what you were going to plant here?
Well, I would credit Wrigley Vineyards for this. So when I first came here, I'm not 100% on this, so I could be wrong, but I think Laurent Montague was still involved with Wrigley at the time. And one of the things that they had done was they had done individual clone bottlings of the Dijon clones. And so you could go into Wrigley and buy like 113, 114, 115, 777, 667, Pomard. And so that's how, other than that, everything that I had tasted through the basically many, many dozens of wineries around were all blends of something. And so I sat down and tasted every one of those, shipped a case of them home, tried them over the next few months, and then evaluating them until I settled on the clones that I liked. And then all of that is just a good guess, because the soils there are different than the soils here. There's some similarity, but nonetheless, soil is probably the primary contributor to how the flavor profile of that particular grape is, or that particular clone is. But anyway, I settled on 777, 115, and Pomard as the first that we would plant here. And so we plant that in the block that we call proposal block, and that's because, just before we bought the property, Jody and I hiked up here. There were no roads or anything, and I think it was December the 28th after we had signed on the paperwork, and we hiked up here, and I proposed to her here. And so that block that we were standing on is called Proposal Block now. So anyway, that's how we ended up getting the clones. Since then, we've added others. I like the 667. It's really a nice structural clone. I kind of attribute it to being like the frame of a house. I mean, and then everything else that gets added to it is the finishing. We've added 828, the notorious Sucre Clace clone that came in from France. Let's see, we have Wadensville as well we've added. So those are the clones of Pinot Noir that we have here.
What made you choose, well, specifically the 828? How did you go about acquiring it, and what made you want to add it to the mix?
Well, it was very intriguing. First of all, I didn't really know the story until I had heard in passing about it. So I had heard rumors about it, and to make things complicated, there's two 828s. One is shrouded in mystery. The other one is named 828. One is very droopy growing. The other one is very upright growing. And I just took a gamble on it because I had been doing a Google search and saw on a website from a writer named Rusty Gaffney. He's called the Prince of Pinot. And he had an article in there about the 828 and talked about it. And so I go in and do a Google search, and wow, it popped. Of all things, what happened was I got hit for a auction catalog for a nursery in California that was going out of business and was having a trustee auction. And on the auction calendar or catalog was like 2,500 vines of 828. So I just took a gamble, and I didn't know and planted them, and I didn't know till they had a little bit of growth on them, whether I had the droopy variety or the upright variety. And so I had the favored upright variety after a period of time. So it's really a quite remarkable clone. Extraordinary, frankly.
So obviously, we talked about your farming background, and so tell me about the process of learning your vineyard, setting up your vineyard, learning your vineyard, and figuring out the way to sort of maximize the quality of what you get out of the vineyard each year.
Well, very first plantings we made, the research I had said narrow spacing, narrow rows. So I started with 7x4 spacing, believing that would be 7 feet by 4 feet. So 7 feet for the width, 4 feet for the row or between vines. And that worked fine for the first plantings, but remember the first things I planted was straight up and down. Subsequently, I've had to go to 8x4 because if you're on a little bit of a side slope, you get drift with your equipment and your tractor. And so then you start cutting into the roots and the bases of the other plants. And so we've planted probably 2 different spacings. I prefer the 7x4s, but the 8x5 or 8x4s and 5s are necessary just simply because of the way the slope of the ground. And so that's created a little bit of a challenge. If I was to redo that, I wouldn't have that kind of spacing because it makes it difficult. You're duplicating your equipment that you need. So it was an unnecessary expense to get a mower or a disc for that extra foot when I probably could have just planted it still 7x4 and been fine. But if that's the most expensive mistake I ever made up here, I'm pretty fortunate. So
I'm curious, describe for me the terroir of this place, and what do you feel is unique about this property and the grapes that come from here versus anybody else?
So I suppose, well, this is the research I've done, and I suppose somebody can challenge me on it at some point. But as I understand it, from the research I've done, when the Nestucca Range was formed and the lava flows that occurred that formed that from about McMinnville north, there's very, very thick, dense lava flows. And that is the parent material for the soils that are in the Dundee Hills and what's north of McMinnville. And that's why you go up into the Dundee Hills and you have singularly jory soils, volcanic, high clay capacity, high water holding capacity. But from McMinnville south, what we had was fingers of lava running across ocean bottom. So they were more like rivers, and then they were spaced in between with just ocean bottoms. So they didn't have that solid sheet of magma that was flowing. So as they uplifted, we have the San Juan plate that's subducting under the continental plate. That's what's created these Coast Range foothills. And that soil then gets lifted above the water and begins to deteriorate, and that parent material becomes soil. We have a different mix of soils. So what we have are jory soils that are very comparable. The fruit that comes from those areas are very comparable to what comes out of Dundee. But then the fruit that comes out of our sedimentary soils, those soils have about a 30% lower water holding capacity. The berries are smaller. They're a little more tannic because you have because the berries are smaller, you have a higher skin to juice contact ratio. And so they're very intensely flavored. So when you put all of those together, the wines here are very unique because they're highly complex. But it's really driven by the soils.
Tell me about the winemaking process for you. Obviously tied into the farming, but take me through the sort of the annual nature of winemaking for you, and what are the biggest moments of decision and sort of speculation for you in the annual process?
There are things that you can say are optimum. So let's say that you didn't have outside influences and you could just let your fruit hang as long as you wanted. And when it was perfectly ripe, then you would harvest and you'd have incredible wines. The reality of it is we are in a position, all of Oregon, that when fall comes, you get a huge migration of birds that come out of Washington and Canada that start working their way south. And there are robins and cedar waxwings are two of the primary ones, but starlings are very common as well. And so if we are fortunate and have a fall that we don't have the rains and storms up north, then the birds will stay up north because they have adequate food sources. As soon as the rains do start, they start pushing flocks of birds to the south, and those birds only fly as far as they need to go to get something to eat. So you can be driving up and down the highways and you'll see them lined up on the power lines just sitting there, or in trees, just clouds of them. And you can get cedar waxwings and starlings that will move in and they'll take out hundreds of pounds of fruit in an hour. And so we have bird cannons and things like that. So farming has become difficult as we get larger population bases, because some of the things we use for scare tactics for the birds to get ourselves to harvest is offensive to neighbors. They're tired of hearing a cannon going off all day long. Broadcast speakers that are shrieking birds, sounds like a bird is being killed by a hawk or something like that. So that's becoming problematic. And then what ends up happening is you end up doing things like netting the fruit. Very, very expensive process. So the farming costs themselves continue to increase and they just get passed along. Unfortunately, wine gets more and more expensive. but it's a byproduct of some of the things that we have that are environmental influences. So those are things that probably people struggle with. The prevalence of mold and mildew in this area is not uncommon, particularly in areas that don't see a lot of wind. And that's one of the factors on this property that's so beneficial is we are in the Coast Range foothills on the north rim of the Van Duzer corridor. So what happens is as the valley heats up in the day, creates a vacuum and it pulls cold or cool air off the ocean through the Van Duzer corridor. So every day, probably around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we start getting these cool breezes that come out of the west. And so what we enjoy is full photosynthesis, but because we don't have as high a heat, we're not getting the sugar accumulation, but we're getting physiological ripeness of the berries. And so the flavor is there, and we're able to let the fruit hang a little bit longer, or as long as we can stand the birds. But because we're relatively isolated out here, most of the birds are opportunistic, and they'll focus in areas where there's quite a few vineyards. So that's one of the factors that really makes wines unique here is the presence of that breeze. And I think that's probably demonstrated most from 2020 when we had the big fires that were here and filled the valley with smoke because everybody, Dundee area, Chehalem Mountains, anything over in the Eola Hills, they were just really had a difficult problem because of the density of the smoke. And grapes will absorb that into the skins, and then when the wine is made, it becomes prevalent. We're fortunate that we had these winds that would come in and then clear our area out. We never really had a density of smoke that we think actually impacted our wines because everything was blowing from the west, and so it blew any smoke we had here back towards the Eola Hills. And so that pretty unique feature about this property here, and there's starting to be more and more people that are moving up into these hills around here and buying property, and you can see more and more vineyards starting up here.
What about once the grapes come off the vine? Tell me about your process, winemaking process, how you sort of learned making wine at a commercial scale, and how your sort of methodology has changed in the years, if it has at all.
My methodology has changed when one of my experiments turns out to have revealed maybe I need to change things. So that's happened good and bad. But basically what I do is I have my primary protocol, and that's where my large fermenters, we ferment and process in what is our customary protocol. But I always have a small experiment going where I'm trying something like a different enzyme, a different quantity of enzyme for extraction of color. Maybe it's a different yeast. Maybe it's a hotter ferment. Any of those things I'm trying, but it's typically in a quantity that is not going to cause a financial impact to us, or if it fails, if I have to pour it out, is not going to be a problem. But those are incremental changes I do each year. I think we have a pretty solid protocol. One of the people I thank and think helped me probably as much as anything was Robert Britton. Extremely generous of his time and on some problems that I had, and allowed me to correct some problems that was highly educational. So really a very, very generous person. We started our first winemaking at the Coleman's, and so that's where I first made our first wine. And so we moved from the Coleman's up here to our property, and then we started here. And so I have attended a number of winemaking seminars, and I try and maintain contact with as many winemakers as I know. Yamhill Valley Vineyards, Ariel Eberly is one of just a unbelievably talented, gifted person who shared her knowledge with me freely. And I think generally the people in Oregon, the winemakers, are kind of different. They're all more concerned about raising brand Oregon as a whole, as opposed to just benefiting just themselves. I go tasting regularly still at other places, and we'll visit with the winemaker if they're there, and I don't think I've ever had anyone say, "Oh, I can't share that with you," or something like that. It's pretty much in the winemaking community around here, it's an open book. And I think part of that is because everybody recognizes each of our sites are so unique and different that what I do may not necessarily work for you, but I'm not going to withhold what I do in case you can use something from it. So I think that's something that's probably unique around here, and so I extend the same courtesy to anybody else who comes up here.
Tell me about the finished product in the bottle. What are you aiming for, and what would be sort of the ultimate takeaway from someone who tastes one of your wines?
One of the things that I find as a compliment, if somebody says, "That's a really nicely made wine," it's not my style or it's not my preference. That's sometimes how they'll prefer. So they say, "I don't like Chardonnay, but wow, that's really nicely made." Or it could be, I don't really like Syrah, but wow, that's really a nicely made Syrah. That's what I like. I like that I have delivered the best of my skills to somebody. It's up to them and their palate to then decide whether that's suitable to them, because there are so many variations. There's over 1,000 chemicals and components that go into a bottle of wine that are natural, that any one of them could have a more significant impact depending on the heat units for the year, wind, type of yeast you use, so many different variables. At least if it was well made, then the rest of it is kind of out of your hands. And so that's the best you can do. Just bring your best to the table and let the consumer decide if they like it.
So talk about you talked about building the business. Talk about kind of where it is now. The slogan, "All things are possible." Tell me how that reflects and captures what you've built here.
Well, all things are possible started with the dream with two people standing up here looking at a Christmas tree farm. And everything else we've done. You see this here, we built this by hand, and we planted it, and we farm it, and Jody is the salesperson, and she graciously allows me to be the figurehead, when people come in, and I'm the winemaker and that sort of thing. And so, it was a dream, and I think we've achieved it because we came out to an area that did not have vineyards or an established winery. I do remember when we bought this property and we told some people what we were going to do, they said, "You'll never make it. It's just too cold over there. You'll never grow a crop. You'll never get it ripe." And that's kind of scary when you plunk down 7 figures for a piece of ground that still needed a lot of work. So it turns out those same naysayers are buying over here. So that's not a bad deal.
Obviously, core values very important to you and the business here. So family, integrity and character, initiative, personal and professional growth, respect, diversity and inclusion, superior quality and service. Tell me about coming up with those and how you feel your actions so far have reflected those.
Well, of course, when you're in a corporate world, you're just bombarded with everybody's beliefs and core values, etc. And so we sat down as a team with some people that are our board of advisors, and we tried to come up with the things that were really important to us as we evolved. And we like to look at the longevity of our employees. We like to look at the size of our wine club, how we fit as a role within the community, how we support the local community at large, whether they're wine or not. And those are the things that we came up with that says, if we were a customer, this is the kind of place that we would go visit. And I guess it's you could distill it down to, treat other people like you'd like to be treated. And so we've tried to become a fixture in the community. We allow funeral services in here, weddings. We hold meetings for the school board, for the police department, the fire department. It's just because a little small community doesn't really have a lot of resources. So we offer our resources that we have to the members of the community to try and help advance our local area, because it is a rural area, and it can be, there are some people here that don't have the resources as other people in other areas, and so we try and be, I think stewards of the community is a wrong phrase, but good citizens of the community would probably be a better way of saying, so that we contribute. We may not necessarily write a check to somebody to support their campaign or whatever, but we provide to the community in different ways. We haul all of our cardboard boxes down to the food centers so that they use our cardboard boxes to distribute the meals for the week for people, and little things like that we're constantly doing to try and help where we can.
Obviously, with a business like this, you've built a community of family and friends who are helping you out at the kind of important parts of the year. So, tell me about harvest, production, bottling, times like that where your friends and family have come together to get things done. What are some memories you look back at from moments like that?
Oh man, I think the first one that's first and foremost that just leaps out at me when you talk about harvest was, I can't remember the exact year, it was probably 2013, I'm guessing. So one of my family members had an unfortunate incident over in Idaho, and so we had left to go attend a funeral. And when we came back, we drove up the hill, and up above the property here, all we could see was just a huge cloud of birds. And they were in the Pinot Gris, that's the earliest ripening. And so that's where they were focused, and there were tens of thousands of them. And we said, we're going to lose our crop. So there's my mom and my aunt there. My mom's in her 70s. My aunt's a little older than her. Jody, me, we're out picking Pinot Gris, trying to save what we could. And I think we became so exhausted after one bin of fruit, all we were able to save was maybe 30, 40 cases worth of Pinot Gris that year. The birds finished it off, and it's because our cannons had ran out of propane while we were over in Idaho for her funeral. And so that was a lesson, but it also that was a hardship. We got over it, and we learned from that and recognized that was a challenge. And I guess what's fortunate, we didn't have too much more than that, but they still put a hurt on us, at least as far as that crop. And so there's things like that that occurs. There's things that happen where that are total accidents, mixing the wrong spray and spraying something and you have vines that wilt and you go, oh no, hope that they live. Just total accidents. And there's just things that happen that you just have to pull together and recognize those things happen. Doesn't matter if you live in the city and you got a job at the supermarket or what it is. Everybody has challenges in life, and it's not how they manage you, it's how you manage them. And so we just believe strongly, I do, that hey, if I didn't get it this time, I'll sure as heck get it next time. So I just think every day is another opportunity to succeed.
We talked a bit earlier about your previous profession. I'm curious if you want to compare and contrast a little bit your kind of corporate life versus small business owner, winemaker life here. What are the biggest differences, and what are the things that have kind of carried through?
So it's both of them are difficult, and it doesn't matter what kind of job you have. I mean, you could be a floor manager at Walmart or whatever. It doesn't matter. You have your own challenges, you have your responsibilities, those sorts of things. So same for me in corporate, and same for me here. I've got certain challenges. I've got problems with weeds, I've got problems with birds, pricing of contracts, chemical prices going up. You're managing some kind of problem every single day. In a corporate world, the same thing is happening. The biggest difference is when you're in the corporate world and you're doing that job, it never stops. So at the end of the day, the next day is going to be just like what you just finished. There isn't an end to it. Here, you have satisfaction because you go, hey, our fruit's ripe. I get to stop spraying now. I don't have to worry about mildew. And then crews come in and harvest, and you go, wow, I don't even have to worry about the vineyard at all now for 4 months. Not actually true, but for a period of time, before you have to start doing husbandry practices and mowing and disking and all of pruning and all of that. But nonetheless, there are very distinct chapters in the life of a vineyard over the course of a year that you get past this chapter and we're on to the next. So you get these little mini closures that are small victories as you move through the course of the year. And then when you finally get everything in the tank, in the winery for that vintage, that's cause for wild celebration.
All about the small victories.
Yes. Yes.
You brought up earlier starting a small business and also having a young family at the same time. Tell me about memories of raising your family in this place and of all the things sort of growing together.
Okay, this is kind of an interesting one because there's a little philosophy behind this too. So when we first had a family, we still have a family, but they were young. And so it was both Jody and I's first children. So Jordan was the oldest, Hayes was our youngest, so we had 2 children. And we would come up here, and we were living in McMinnville still, and I would come out and farm when I wasn't working, so it'd be the weekends, late nights, whatever. And Jody would come out here, and we'd spread the blankets and have a picnic and things like that. And then one of the things that we did was we would let the kids just run around naked on the property in the dirt. They just filthy. But I think in the end, they're very healthy people, and maybe exposure to the dirt and all of those things like that helped with their immune system and whatever. But I remember those memories while we were just starting out where we had those very private times up here because it was just our place.
Tell me about the slogan, all dreams are possible, and what that's meant to what you've built here.
Well, we came up with our all dreams are possible, help from staff and our board of advisors.
So you're talking about your raising your family. You're talking about being your place to start. What was it like to share the place? What was it like to invite people here and to start to make it part of the community?
I think one of the things that still gets me is that's significant is when you drive up here, you don't really appreciate what's here until you crest out on top, and then you look out and you go, "There's this wow factor that is just grabs you, and it's as nice a view as there is in the valley. It's impressive. We can see what's left of Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, Mount Jefferson, the Sisters. Those are 150-mile views, and a big chunk of the valley. It's unbelievable to live here, and that's your backyard, is having this. And it's just remarkable. I spent since 2008 here, and every day it still gets me. It's just so spectacular. I feel very blessed.
So what were the sort of skills and experiences that you hoped your life here would sort of give your kids for the future?
I think the biggest thing I hope that they take away from this is the ability to have long-term goals and understand that instant gratification is not always possible. That if you really want to accomplish something, you might have to develop a plan that is years in the making. And there may be multiple steps to get there. You don't just say, gee, today I want to do X, Y, Z, and then order it from Amazon. That doesn't work doing something like this. And in between, there's a lot of hours and a lot of hard work where you go, I don't like doing this. But those things are steps along the way to achieve something. And if you do that and you finally achieve that, the depth of appreciation is remarkable.
So if you're thinking back to the first day you saw this property, what do you wish you had known then that you know now?
I wished, even though I had grown up on a farm, I wished that I had spent some time working in a vineyard operation where I had a better understanding of the equipment that was needed, because that can really catch you by surprise and you don't have it adequately budgeted. And even though you might find a piece of equipment extremely necessary, it might be a $25,000 piece of equipment you use twice a year for 10 or 12 hours. So there are some things that are expenses that will jump out and nab you that you don't really anticipate. I'm fortunate that I did grow up on a farm and have some knowledge of farming and was able to teach myself an awful lot. But there are still things that get you by surprise that you didn't expect.
Well, on that kind of same trajectory here, now that you're looking back at all you've done with this property, is this what you expected it to be? And what have been the biggest surprises along the way?
It's wildly exceeded my expectations as far as the quality of the wine and the quality of the vineyard. It has surprised me how difficult it has been to develop it, like roads, clearing timber, stumping trees, things like that. And a lot of that comes from the need to have really, really heavy equipment, dozers and things like that are very, very expensive. So I underestimated what it would cost to develop it as far as the really undeveloped areas where there was timber and then that sort of thing. The rest of it, I think we were pretty accurate on. It's also surprised me a little bit on the winemaking side how much more involved that part of it is as well. Winemaking is an absolute science not something you just throw a handful of yeast at a tub of juice and hope it turns out. So, so I would have benefited, I think, with a little more time tutoring under somebody, or let me rephrase that, apprenticing under someone. But I'm also a pretty good self-starter and attended as many seminars as I could, and conversations with people. And in the end, to this point, I think we've done a pretty solid job. The beautiful wines come off of this property.
What are you kind of proudest of on that side of things, and what have been the biggest surprises about building a small business?
Building a small business is far more difficult than expected, because when you're in a corporate arena, you have one discipline. You're in marketing, or you're in sales, or you're in finance, whatever, and you focus exclusively in those areas. Occasionally you'll have your once weekly or once monthly meetings with the heads of the other departments, but they can oftentimes just be very superficial. When you're in a small business operation like this, you wear all those hats. And so you yourself have to be the one to resolve some of the many conflicts that occur from those different, all of those different pieces of the business. So, but I think overall, it's been easier for Jody and I, because it hasn't been one person. Jody is the person that is the genius when it comes to marketing, relationship building. She handles the marketing and that sort of thing. I manage the winemaking, the farming, and then I try and be available for customers as much as I can, because Jody's one of the J's as well as I, but it's my family's brand and that sort of thing. And so I try and make myself present. So that piece, that demand is what I probably underestimated, because we're so remote and so localized that we become part of the community, friends with nearly everyone who comes up here. And so anytime anybody comes up, they say, "Oh, could John or Jody just pop in and say hi?" It's the Olsons, or what, pick a name. And so you find that the demands on your time, you get stretched pretty thin. I guess that's the price of success, because the alternative would be not so good. That would be your banker calling you.
None of your neighbors knowing your name.
Right.
I want to broaden out for just a second and talk about the Oregon wine industry a little bit. Tell me about the changes you've seen in the industry, and the sort of the challenges in it, and what the industry looks like today in 2022.
I see some very, very significant changes that are happening now. Some of them beneficial, some of them I don't know about beneficial, but just inevitable. So the first thing that's occurred is there's been a very large influx of outside money coming into the area, investing in the properties here. Other areas in the country are becoming less suitable for grapes. Water being one of the key aspects with that, the inability to have adequate water for raising a crop. And that's typically our neighbors to the south. Southern Oregon is no different. They're experiencing the same thing. We dry farm, which means we don't irrigate. We probably hand irrigate our vines 2 or 3 times the first year, sometimes once the second year. And then after that, they survive on whatever rain is in, or water is in the soil column. And we can do that because we have very deep soils here. So that's highly beneficial. We don't have the costs for the irrigation systems that's typically involved in California and even in Southern Oregon. And so it becomes very desirable when you have what's established as a world-class growing area, that the annual farming costs are less simply because you don't have challenges around water. That's not to say that won't always happen, but we're not being threatened by having our water shut off and diverted to municipalities and things like that. So I see that as one of the biggest factors. Is the industry itself up here is going to continue to change, and it changes towards the smaller people like us are probably not going to be able to continue for longer periods of time. It's going to be corporate driven. It's really hard for a family farm to survive because you don't necessarily have children that are willing to take it over and continue to do that. But if you have corporate ownership, then that's just another group of workers to continue to manage it. So that's really what I'm seeing right now as a big change in the industry. Positive influences I see coming in is a lot of French involvement. They seem to have brought a lot of resources here. I've listened to speakers in several different lectures and things of that nature, and I'm very fascinated by some of the things that they say. Taken a trip to France for my own education to see how things are done there, and there's a lot of things that I would change here had I had that opportunity when we first started. But there is going to be change in Oregon. That's inevitable. You're going to see a trend towards the bigger brands, and some of the smaller brands are probably going to either be bought out or just folded. And you'll start seeing bigger and bigger farms. But that's not any different than what you see now. Driving through the valley, you see, hay farms that are 4,000 or 5,000 acres. The equipment that it takes to run those type of operations, you need that kind of acreage. And so it's just inevitable. That's going to continue to happen.
As you look back now, what are you proudest of?
I would probably have to say that I am proudest that this was a family accomplishment. So I'm pretty sure I couldn't have done it by myself. And so I had my beautiful wife to help.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much
Okay.
for your time here today, for your wonderful answers and storytelling. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.